partners. In January 2019, the World Economic Forum published the Principles of Climate Governance. Since then, country chapters have been launched all around the world, including the Malaysian chapter, Climate Governance Malaysia, which is the second in the world and first in Asia Pacific. Now we are delighted to announce the ASEAN Climate Governance Network. The ASEAN Network is supported by all Institute of Directors in ASEAN who are championing increased climate literacy on boards, adoption of climate governance on boards, and better management of the climate risk and opportunities which arise from the climate crisis. To start off the launch, I am honored to invite Sunita Rajakumar, the Chairman of Climate Governance Malaysia, and Karina, the Chairman of the Global Climate Governance Initiative, to say a few words and set the scene for today's event. Over to you, Sunita and Karina.
Thank you so much, Sita. Thank you for hosting this event today. Welcome, everyone, to the launch of ASEAN Climate Governance Network. My name is Sunita Rajakumar, and I am the Chairman of Climate Governance Malaysia and this brand new network, ASEAN Climate Governance Network.
Thank you, Sunita. And I'm Karina Litvack, founder and chairman of the Climate Governance Initiative, which is, as you've heard, an initiative of the World Economic Forum. The forum published, as you heard from Sita Lakshmi, the principles of climate governance for effective climate governance in January 2019. I am so pleased to report that we are now present in 21 countries with over 100,000 members, and the addition of the ASEAN network today brings us to 29 countries. We haven't even begun to count how many additional non-executive directors are a member of our network.
We were both delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to see so many supporters in the audience. Businesses all around the world are stepping up with urgent action to manage, mitigate, and adapt to climate risks. The world has already warmed by 1.2 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels, and the WMO indicates that there is a 40% chance of hitting 1.5 degree of warming in the next few years.
With the overwhelming amount of science warning us about the risks, and you've heard it from the dinosaur, but what the dinosaur didn't tell you is that climate change also poses a material risk to business and to the stability of the global financial system. And what does that mean for us as board directors? It means that if we fail to take account of this as part of our normal director duties, we are failing, we are negligent in our duties. And so the essence of the principles for effective climate governance is to give you all the tools that you need to fulfill those obligations as directors.
So this launch today is significant. The coming together of all institutes of directors in the region, building capacity amongst directors as long-term stewards of their organizations, and advocating for urgent climate action, mitigation and adaptation, as well as opportunities which arise.
We also recognize the significance of the ASEAN region. It's the 5th largest economy. Sitting here in my study in London, it's easy to forget that. But we know that this region will be disproportionately affected by climate events. We've seen the floods, the typhoons, and by the way, you know, I come from Canada. We're starting to see those very extreme effects as well. And when it starts to hit rich countries, that's when you know that the rich countries are going to start to pay attention. Meanwhile, of course, as we've learned from the disruptions of the pandemic, this region is the factory for the world. It provides goods and services on which we all depend. And again, the climate threat, even worse than the pandemic threat, this is all bringing to the fore the degree of interdependence that we all experience.
Absolutely. So we're so pleased that we have a great lineup for you today. We have knowledge, experience, and passionate individuals who want to share their thoughts with you.
And with that, let's get started. I now declare the ASEAN Climate Governance Network officially launched. Congratulations to all the institutes of directors and hardworking directors who've made this possible. I and our future generations thank you, and thank you for all the hard work that I know you're going to do for us.
Thank you. Back to you, Sita.
Thank you, Sunita. Thank you very much, Sunita and Karina. This is truly a historic occasion to be part of the launch of the ASEAN Climate Governance Network. Moving on to our first keynote speaker, I'd like to invite Anouj Mehta, the Country Director of Thailand Resident Mission and Unit Head of the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, to give us an overview of climate risk in the ASEAN region.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone across the across the virtual world that we live in now. My name is Anouj Mehta with the Asian Development Bank, and I look after the Southeast Asia Innovation Hub, which includes the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, which logo is represented here on the screen behind me. I'm very grateful for the organizers to have the EDB represented here. Delighted to give a few points, I think, as you start the deliberations today at this very important and I think timely conference right at the beginning of this year. I'm going to sort of just take a few minutes of your time to talk about a couple of things. Really, the agenda is, of course, climate risks. To really put it in context and sort of set the background for the rest of the day's deliberations. But I also want to talk a little bit about emerging solutions, so the risks and the solutions which are now emerging. At the outset, I think it's very important to just identify what's actually what's at stake here. Climate change could risk GDP losses of up to 11% by 21 in Southeast Asia, while biodiversity loss could place more than half of global GDP at risk. Now, this is important, and especially the region that I look after, Southeast Asia, or from the innovation hub's perspective, is very much at risk from the impacts of climate change. And when you look at the numbers, of course, the numbers are staggering in terms of their impacts. And if you look at the global numbers on the right-hand side here, $44 trillion at risk of disruption, share of the global GDP at risk from biodiversity loss. And of course, these are all interdependent. Climate change, biodiversity, oceans, forests, heavily linked together. Southeast Asia is specifically at huge risk from this, long coastlines, a lot of threat of flooding. And what's even worse in terms of where the countries are across the globe, I think one thing that came out very clearly at the COP conference that we were all in November last year in Glasgow, is that we're not on track. So the individual contributions submitted to date would only cut about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, I think was the estimate, quite far off the target needed according to the IPCC. So in terms of the problem, we know what the problem is, but in terms of are we on track, it's not so much the case. Now, if you look at some of the individual risks, which put this in terms of context, when you just go away from sort of a global, sort of umbrella in terms of climate, the individual factors that we're seeing more and more happening, and this is not academic, this is actually happening. The increasing salinization, oceans acidification, loss of biodiversity, extreme events, weather events, whether they're rainfall or floods or cyclones, and of course, several of our cities in Southeast Asia, we're already seeing this global threat of sea level rise. So the risks which are very visible in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the developing world that I work in, make it a very, very real and present problem which needs to be solved. And with countries with greater coastlines, greater development happening, with a greater development of infrastructure, the effects are just going to keep increasing. And of course, with equitable development also required, infrastructure, economic growth, urban development, the growth of urban centers is likely to keep moving at pace, which will therefore have a lot more effect on climate unless the development is sustainable and climate resilient. A small difference in how much the temperature rise is limited to can make a huge impact. And I think now there's a big discussion about trying to limit risks to 1.5, to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And this has an impact not just in terms of just sort of what we see as extreme weather events, but it has an impact on individual lives and livelihoods, mental health, mortality, risk of chronic health issues. We are seeing massive number of deaths simply due to the air pollution in our urban areas, and risk of disease transmission. I think there is even more evidence now emerging from the melting of glaciers, leading rise to further diseases which may emerge, which have been hidden for so long under the glaciers. So a number of statistics which have been put over here in terms of the extreme weather events and the difference between 1.5 and 2, and what we need to do to really try and limit temperature increase to 1.5. Now, if I look at the progress that has actually happened, it's not all been bad. There has been a progress in SDGs and climate. A lot of countries have put green climate policies in place. There are NDC commitments which have been renewed and efforts being made towards that. In Southeast Asia alone, I know the energy ministers have created a new goal for renewable energy targets in the mix of energy, and that's very promising. And a lot of work which is being done on energy transition across the region. So there are good progress initiatives. I see a lot of solar park projects happening in a number of different countries, recycling, reuse, etc. And the policy is certainly very clear, and there is a lot of interest in making it happen, and good project examples, but a lot more is needed. And especially if you look at the progress on SDGs in Asia and the Pacific, it's this balance of trying to manage the scarce resources we have. Our marine population has declined 49% in the last 50 years. Coral reefs, 90% loss expected by 2052. So we've got the resources which are under threat and depleting. But at the same time, we've also got that large number, which is in extreme poverty. So we still need to have development, which is sustainable. How do we manage this interplay of climate change, managing that and managing sustainable development? So, with this sort of conundrum, it's also important to sort of go from what's needed to numbers. And finance, the focus that I always try to bring in any of my discussions on climate is infrastructure is a big component of meeting the climate challenge. The amount of financing needed for climate resilient infrastructure across Asia, 1.7 trillion a year. And that's a large amount, especially because there's a huge financing gap in there between public and what's available from the public and private sectors. With that annual gap increasing every year, the amount of financing going into climate resilient infrastructure is obviously the big challenge. And so I think a lot of the effort that needs to go into meeting the climate risks are about basically addressing the climate infrastructure challenge, which therefore means catalyzing capital from public and private sectors. So, where I'm trying to basically lead this to is to deal with climate risk, we need to catalyze financing or green financing into green infrastructure across Southeast Asia, but also across most of the areas the regions that we work in here in Asia. From that issue, let me sort of also very quickly talk a little bit about what has been happening, and it's worth highlighting that there have been good efforts made. I'll just talk about one of the examples in the ADB that we're working on, which is the ACGF, the ASEAN Green Facility, which is managed by us, but it is an ASEAN vehicle owned by all the countries in Southeast Asia. We manage it on their behalf. And in its 2.5 years since its inception, it came with this basic premise that public sector money needs to de-risk projects, create green projects, de-risk them, and therefore catalyze private capital into such projects. And that is happening at a rapid pace. From fresh, sort of launch in 2019, the ACGF is now a $2 billion fund. It's been able to raise funding from various sources, donors as well as multilaterals as well as bilateral donors, which is being addressed for these objectives. And how it's doing it is by integrating both the development of projects, but also the development of capacities and then access to finance in this innovative way, which is de-risking, which is trying to say a project must not just be green, but it also must be bankable and able to catalyze private capital. So it's got a sort of an integrated three-pronged approach, which is working quite well. A number of partners which have come into supporting ACGF, including the Green Climate Fund, the UK government, the Italian government, French Agency for Development, the EIB, as well as knowledge partners. So quite a number of partners supporting the ACGF, and it just shows that there is interest to really develop this bankable green pipeline across the region. One key thing to perhaps mention over here is the need to develop good projects which are not mainstream. And as an example, we've been asked a number of times, can the ACGF help in developing these offshore solar projects, for example, offshore wind projects, battery storage projects, which have not been tried and tested yet in a particular country. And so the technical assistance is available to try and create these risky, new technology, new financing model structures, new bond approaches, and really make this happen so that you have a pilot in place which demonstrates success and then it can be replicated. So not only is there a risk of climate, there's also risk of implementation of projects, especially with these new technologies and finance models, which the ACGF provides technical assistance to developing, some of which is mentioned over here. And there have been good examples of this, such as the bonds which have been issued recently in the region with our support, or the development of the solar project in Cambodia with our support, and so on. Now, if I conclude basically with this slide, which is it's the issue of meeting climate risks across the region requires not just addressing one or two projects, but it requires addressing the sector's need as a whole. And therefore, an approach like a national catalytic vehicle, such as the ACGF, which is of course regional, but at a national level, could be a solution to both creating the policy which is needed to address climate risks, but also in actually making a pipeline of projects, not just one or two, but a scalable pipeline of projects happen, which can therefore drive in the capital needed from the public and private sectors to really hit that target of climate resilient infrastructure that we need and need urgently. And I think ACGF would therefore be a good example to take forward. I'll stop there with basically commending this conference, which is happening at such a good time. And I really wish the discussions a lot of good luck and good speed, and I hope a lot of good actions emerge from the discussions today. We stand ready at ADB and ACGF to support the development of new ideas, new projects, and of course in helping access finance. And thank you very much for this opportunity, and look forward to seeing the deliberations that happen further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anouj, for your most insightful remarks. Our next keynote speaker is Eugene Wong, the CEO of Sustainable Finance Institute Asia. Eugene will share his thoughts about ASEAN climate transition.
Thank you very much, Sita. Well, let me first begin by congratulating all of you on the launch of the ACGN today. I think this is a tremendous effort, and I'm really delighted to be here to share my views. Anouj just now provided a really clear and somewhat frightening picture about the impact of climate change. The bottom line is that we have now established through science, evidence, and experience that climate change is real and it has a global impact. And because of that, it will have a global response. We're not talking about something that people are going to lose interest in over time, but instead the opposite, something that will become more integrated in our lives. Climate change has resulted in a paradigm shift covering business, perception and attitudes, and finance. Let's first look at the business impact. I mean, right now, parties that have pledged net zero cover almost 70 regions, 1,000 over cities, 5,000 over companies, 1,000 over educational institutions, 400 over main investors, and 50 over healthcare institutions. Customers are starting to look at the carbon footprint of their suppliers very seriously. Businesses that are not climate aligned face a real risk of being excluded from supply chains. And because ASEAN nations are really export driven, the supply chain and customers will be pushing for change, with MNCs willing to spend more on net zero products and services. A study by Standard Chartered revealed that MNCs will cut suppliers for failing to curb carbon emissions, with 78% of them planning to remove suppliers that endanger their own carbon transition plans by 2025. Some 45% actually said they'll pay a premium of 7% on average for a product or service from a net zero supplier. Secondly, the perception and attitudes of stakeholders are changing. I mean, people you talk to will give you this impression as well. Society has grown more knowledgeable and enlightened. Customer boycotts, societal pressure, including on government policy, can affect businesses. Climate court action is increasing globally. Young people in the Netherlands sued their government for the lack of action on climate change, and they won. The court ordered the government to reduce emissions by some 25% the next year. The Colombian government was also sued for not protecting the rainforest, and the court ruled that deforestation violated the rights of youth and the rainforest. More interestingly, a 7-year-old girl in Pakistan was allowed to sue on climate change. In Germany, legal action resulted in the nation's net zero target being moved from 2050 to 2045. Shareholders of oil majors like Exxon, Shell, Chevron have all put pressure on their boards. There's a growing movement that it is a board's fiduciary duty to take climate change into account, very much like what Karina was saying just now. Then, of course, important for all of you, the availability of capital will be affected. In the 11th EY and IIF Risk Management Survey, 90% of Asia-Pac bank CROs surveyed view climate change as a top long-term emerging risk over the next 5 years. Now, this is up from 59% in 2019. But what is even more interesting is that every Asia-Pacific bank CRO viewed climate change as a top risk in the near term, with all of them believing that it required urgent attention over the next 12 months. Now, this compares to just 49% of bank CROs globally who view it as a short-term priority. So, for those of you who think that climate change is a Western movement, you have to think again. The availability of capital and or the cost of capital will be impacted for businesses globally, including in this part of the world, if they are not climate aligned. On top of that, global action on climate change will transmit through the supply chain, affecting businesses in this part of the world. The fact that policymakers in ASEAN are coming up with guidance to help orient the flow of capital into sustainable and climate-friendly investments and activities shows the seriousness of this issue. The Financial Services Authority of Indonesia, OJK, BSP, the Filipino Central Bank, Bank Negara Malaysia, the Monetary Authority of Singapore have all come up with guidance to their banks to take into account sustainability aspects and risk when lending money. The Thai Bankers Association has issued responsible lending guidelines. Capital market regulators are also asking for more disclosures and encouraging capital market participants to take climate risks into consideration, while the insurance regulators are equally concerned about how climate change will affect the industry and are taking action. In conjunction with the recent COP26, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, whose members look after 40% of global private capital amounting to $130 trillion US, has committed to transforming the economy to net zero. 450 banks, insurers, and investors across 40 countries are part of this movement, and they have committed to high ambition science-based targets, including achieving net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. A business that is not climate aligned may have to pay more for funding, get shorter funding tenures, have conditions imposed on it, or it may not even get funding at all. So while there's an urgent need to turn green, the world cannot do this overnight. This is something that we cannot do at just the flick of a switch, especially in this part of the world. We will need to do this in an orderly, planned manner. In short, we'll need to transition. And as I said, now this is particularly so for developing countries who will need an orderly transition to avoid social and economic dislocations. ASEAN's financial policymakers have already expressed their goal of adopting such a transition. For businesses, the challenge is straightforward. How do you incorporate this global paradigm shift into your business model, and how quickly must you do it? Regulations, supply chain requirements, availability and cost of financing, and stakeholder demands all come into play. There are many considerations, but the shift is inevitable. So businesses should start their green journey right now. Climate change should feature prominently in the strategic thinking of every director and manager, and will show up in any strategic thinking model. Let's take a bit of a journey back through time for all of those who remember Michael Porter's 5 forces model. Climate change is a central element if you run the model now. Let's go through the model and the 5 forces very quickly, right? Starting with the power of customers. I touched on the power of customers just now. Customers will have more and more demands on climate alignment from those they buy from. This can be for moral reasons or as part of the Scope 3 commitments. It can also be due to the national requirements that the customer has to comply with. What about suppliers? It's the same with them, be it suppliers of capital or for products and services. While competition used to center around the goods and services that are offered, climate alignment of those same goods and services now are a competitive advantage. The same applies to substitutes. Climate aligned substitutes, which are economical and efficient, are a threat to the old order. Take, for example, solar panels. Their price has decreased by up to 90% over the last decade. Liberalizations that will allow new climate-aligned players who have no legacy issues into the market will also present credible threats. Let's take a look at another tool we're all familiar with, the step analysis. Society has made its voice heard, and that voice will continue to become louder and louder. The technological landscape is also supporting climate change alignment and vice versa, with rapid changes in technologies and the level of technology. Many climate change factors will also impact an economy, from actual physical threats as well as international pressure on the country or the credit rating of the country, domestic political pressures as well as international pressures that result in climate change actions embedded in procurement, supply chain requirements, trade agreements, and extraterritorial effects like the carbon border adjustment mechanism are a reality. So too emission caps and carbon taxes. There are many, many things that climate change is going to do to the way you run your business. So clearly, directors need to ensure that they do their part to steer their companies in light of the climate change transition challenge. As usual, where there are challenges, there'll also be opportunities. Businesses that are able to shift their paradigms faster and embrace the agenda will benefit from the demand by customers for environmentally aligned suppliers and for goods and services that are produced in this environmentally friendly manner. It can possibly even fill gaps left by those who cannot keep up. There are opportunities to develop environmentally friendly technologies and processes that will provide competitive advantages and new markets. Of course, climate transition needs to be financed. We all know that finance is the lifeblood of any business. Investments have to be made, whether it be in the business processes, human capital, or in equipment. As part of the financing process, investors and financiers also want to know what your company is doing about climate change and what its risks are, be they physical risks, business impact, or financial risks such as impairment and stranding. Directors need to make themselves aware of the changing financing criteria that incorporates green, as well as the opportunities that are available. But this gives rise to a question. How do you know what qualifies as green, transition, or something that's totally not acceptable? This is where taxonomies and guidelines come in. In ASEAN, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, which is chaired by the Brunei Darussalam Central Bank, has issued the first version of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance as the overarching ASEAN guide. Bank Negara Malaysia has issued a climate change principles-based taxonomy. OJK has issued its green taxonomy. The Monetary Authority of Singapore has consulted on the Singapore version, and the Thai regulators are planning to issue one. The State Bank of Vietnam has issued green credit reporting guidelines for sectors deemed to be environmentally friendly, while the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment has also issued a list of green compliant activities that will serve as a reference for financial institutions. The ASEAN Green Bond Standards issued by the ASEAN Capital Market Regulators also provides guidance. Your bankers and investors are also developing a house position and processes for themselves. At the same time, more and more incentives are being provided to help companies through this transition. For example, Enterprise Singapore introduced the Enterprise Financing Scheme Green, which provides financing support for Singapore businesses to develop enabling technologies and solutions to do things like reducing waste, optimizing resource usage, and minimizing greenhouse gas emissions in order to be able to participate in the growing opportunities in the green economy. Bank Negara Malaysia has introduced a 1 billion low carbon transition facility to support and encourage SMEs to adopt sustainable practices for business resilience. Banks are pivoting to sustainability lending, and Malaysian financial institutions will match the facility that Bank Negara has with $1 billion of their own funds. Bursa Malaysia has entered into MOUs with banks like Alliance, OCBC, and HSBC Amanah to help public listed companies advance the adoption of ESG practices. As directors, you are the stewards of strategic direction and governance. Climate change is a critical issue faced by businesses today. By ensuring that your company embraces the green agenda and implements a transition, you're also ensuring its long-term survival, and your stakeholders are relying on you to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugene, for information you have shared with us. Now, I would like to invite our next keynote speaker, Dr. Victoria Hatton, Director of Sustainability and Climate Change from PricewaterhouseCoopers New Zealand, to speak about Code Red, Asia Pacific's Time to Go Green.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation today. I'm just going to try and share my screen with everybody, if you bear with me. Can you confirm you can see the screen?
Yes, we can, Victoria.
Perfect, thank you. Hi, thanks so much for the opportunity to present here today. As you've already heard, I'm going to present some insights from a recently published paper, Code Red, Asia Pacific's Time to Go Green. The paper focuses on the role of business in the transition to net zero and is available to download. There's a link at the end of the presentation. So transitioning to global net zero requires the rewiring of entire economies, but the reality is that governments cannot meet its net zero commitments alone, and it's a journey that they need to have business come along with them. Businesses will have a crucial role to play, and when we think about climate risk, I'd like to urge you all to think about what the risk to climate would be of business doing nothing as they go along this journey. We're going to cover three things today: the role of the state of decarbonisation in Asia Pacific, why governments and business must collaborate, and reimagining business for net zero. So the current state of play in Asia Pacific, basically we're heading in the wrong direction. I think you've heard from the previous speakers that we're not doing enough to reach the 1.5 degree target. Currently, the world is far below the required 12.9% per year rate of decarbonisation, and we have an annual rate of just 2.5% in 2020. This was up slightly from 2.4% in 2019. This means that annual decarbonisation must accelerate to 5 times its current rate in order to stay on track to not exceed 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. Asia Pacific's average decarbonisation rate in 2020 was just 0.9%. Each year that the world falls below the target to reach net zero, we'll see the required rate of decarbonisation rise to levels that will be increasingly difficult and expensive to achieve, eventually falling out of reach. So the picture here, what I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that over the last sort of 30 years since 1990, the trajectory of decarbonisation has been up and down. So we've not demonstrated that we've been on a pathway to decarbonisation. But in 2020, Asia Pacific was responsible for 52% of the global CO2 energy-related emissions. This is quite significant from a global proportion. And the rate of decarbonisation has actually slowed in recent years, with the highest rate being only 3% in 2015, the year that the Paris Climate Accord was signed. Clearly, existing efforts are falling a long way short of what's required to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and continuing on this trajectory will impose tremendous costs on the global economy and individual well-being for generations to come. Each year that the world falls short of the target will cost an enormous amount of money from both governments and business. So what we'd like to do is urge business to play its part. The region needs to significantly increase its efforts to decarbonise. And I think what you can see here is that Asia Pacific's vast population, economies and communities are extremely vulnerable to climate change. But as long as fossil fuels make up a significant portion of the region's energy mix, decarbonisation will be too slow. So the challenge for everybody is to shift away from fossil fuel derived energy towards low carbon and renewable energy sources, while equitably enabling regional economic growth. So we must be mindful that while territories across the region are at different stages of development and have very different socioeconomic conditions, demand for energy will necessarily vary across the region. Governments across the region are also at varying stages of their net zero journey. So faster decarbonisation will require this fundamental shift in energy systems away from fossil fuel dependent energy sources. It'll need industries, economies, societies, and crucially businesses to all be on board to commit and pursue greater ambition to bend that regional emissions trajectory in this decisive decade. The challenge for the region is supporting the shift away from fossil fuel derived energy towards low carbon and renewable energy sources. But governments and business must collaborate in order to do this. This is not and was never a journey that governments can undertake alone. The data shows that territories across the region are at varying stages of their journey to net zero, which is no surprise given the inherent differences in socio-political and economic circumstances. However, all have one thing in common. Each can only make progress at the necessary pace and scale if policy and regulation complements or accelerates the growing momentum of the business sector. Collaboration between governments and business, sharing the costs, the research and development, innovation, the supply chain and coordination of the global transition to net zero is essential. Businesses and investors have the resources, they have the innovation capacity, and they have the reach needed to radically decarbonise. And there are tremendous opportunities for businesses that move early. There is room to grow in applying climate change policies, and some Asia-Pacific businesses are already seizing the initiative. As the table illustrates, these companies are responding to momentum from a range of stakeholders by pursuing more aggressive emissions reductions and often at a faster rate than governments. There's currently 45 companies within Asia-Pacific that have signed up to what we call the Science Based Targets Initiative, Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees C. CDP, which is a not-for-profit that runs global disclosure systems, has placed 75 Asia-Pacific companies on its A-list for their climate disclosure and activities. Leadership from business and investors in the race to net zero is critically important. It's essential for a healthy, resilient recovery from COVID-19 that prevents future threats, will create jobs and unlock inclusive, sustainable growth. So collaboration will help drive decarbonisation at the necessary pace and scale, and there are clear roles for all actors in the race to net zero. Government are the enablers for net zero. They're responsible for setting the regulatory framework and sending the right signals to business to take action. We see that businesses have a driving role, demonstrating both a responsibility and an opportunity to proactively commit to decarbonise. Not only does this align with the growing consensus of stakeholder capitalism, but the increasing demand for green technologies, products and services also offer unique opportunities for business to expand into new markets. They can leverage green finance, they can generate millions of new sustainable jobs in an equitable manner, helping to minimise the impact on communities and workers in carbon-intensive and hard-to-abate sectors. Such is the momentum towards net zero that those businesses making early commitments will enjoy a first-mover advantage without a doubt, positioning themselves favourably with changing consumer attitudes, new technologies and markets. Which brings me to the consumer. Consumers are those with attitudes who are driving a shift in purchasing behaviour. You've probably all seen it for yourself. They're thinking with their pockets and they're thinking with their ambition for climate change action, with an increasing expectation that business will have a clear and committed stance when it comes to reaching net zero. Businesses that ignore this shift will risk alienating a substantial and growing proportion of their customer base. Today's Gen Y and Gen Z are tomorrow's investors and workforce, industry leaders. They are setting their expectations very high. Consumer, financing, and societal pressures provide a compelling commercial impetus for business to drive the pace of innovation. So reimagining business for net zero. It's a golden opportunity for green growth. The size of the opportunity in front of Asia-Pacific businesses is immense. A commitment to net zero requires every business to reimagine the possible, and based on that vision, deliver an end-to-end transformation of its strategy, operating model, and technology. Climate cannot be an operational afterthought, or even limited to a siloed environmental, social, and governance, or what we call ESG capability, which is growing within business. Instead, it must be woven throughout the entire organisation, culture, and embodied and wholeheartedly sponsored by the leadership. Businesses that fall behind on this transition risk being outmaneuvered by competitors, limiting access to finance, customers, and talent in the process. And instead of being part of the solution, they will be part of the problem, contributing to the systemic risk of a warming world, bringing back to you the thought of the risk of doing nothing. There is scope for Asia-Pacific business to proactively lead the transitions and adopt net zero target, but the time to act is now. So for business, the race to net zero is both a responsibility and an opportunity. But as I've said, the race to net zero for business is becoming legally obligated, as Eugene has already pointed out. Shareholders and investors want to quantify how their actions will create or destroy value in light of the pressures caused by climate change. Post-COVID, business have an opportunity to adopt a sustainable agenda. There's nothing stopping that from happening. Reducing climate change impact, minimizing climate risk is in the long-term interest of all businesses, as the cost of recovering from climate change impact will increase. Severe weather events are increasing, which will cost more in the long term. The early mover advantage is there for taking for early adopters of net zero emissions. So what are the steps to reimagine the possible? Change must start at the top with C-suite and board executives. Leaders must take vocal ownership of their organization's commitment to net zero. That's you all that are sitting on this call. You have an opportunity to start ambition for action. You need to focus on high impact areas: purpose, performance, and people, supply chains, operating model, and also talent. You need to gather data to allow transparent reporting of baseline emissions and progress towards net zero emissions, building trust through targeted reporting on an annual basis. It doesn't matter if you can't provide full transparency in the first year. The idea is that you start reporting and you get better as the years go by. Finally, investment is essential. Financing and delivering the shift to net zero needs innovative and sustainable partnerships between all stakeholders, with public and private investment at scale and speed. There's nothing stopping business from starting this ambitious action for climate change. It's all on you. Thank you.
Amazing sharing, Victoria. I'm sure the audiences were busy making notes as I was. Thank you. And now for our two panel discussions. Our first panel will discuss the topic of enhancing climate resilience of ASEAN businesses. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Johan Rosler. Johan is from Climate Governance Malaysia and the Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia, and he will moderate this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, as the discussion proceeds and questions crop up in your minds, please do write them in the Q&A box. The panel members will try to answer them if time allows. Over to you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Sita. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this first panel of the day, Enhancing Climate Resilience in ASEAN Businesses. Over the next 40 minutes, our three excellent panelists from Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam will share their thoughts on climate change in our region at the corporate level. So, to introduce our panel, and I hope they switch on their cameras, we can see them, Vicky Bowman is a director of the Myanmar Institute of Directors and also of the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business. She's a graduate of Cambridge University in the United Kingdom and was a career diplomat for the UK government. Vicky speaks Burmese and was posted twice to Myanmar, a second time as the UK ambassador. She now lives there. She has worked in the private sector and even has a qualification in accounting, which is very wise. Anthony Chin is a veteran banker from one of Malaysia's top banks. He went to university in both Australia and the UK, and he has been on the board of a bank in Cambodia, and now is Chief Executive Officer of Maruhan, a Japanese-owned bank in Laos. He is a member of the Malaysian Business Council Laos and the Laos National Chamber of Commerce, and he's also on the FinTech board of Lao ICT Commerce Association. Lastly, but no means least, Dominic Scriven is British and he has lived in Vietnam for 30 years, a good long time. He is a Vietnamese speaker and he founded Dragon Capital, which invests $6.5 billion in the country. And he is co-founding vice chair of the Vietnam Institute of Directors. He is passionate about conservation and biodiversity. So we have a great panel from Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, and let's go into it. Now, I'm going to kick off the session with a few questions to the panelists. Audience members, please do use the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, and pose your questions there. I'll scroll through them as we are talking to try and see what is relevant to our panelists and get them to answer. Some of the questions, if they're not really relevant, will actually be answered live, or maybe even by the second panel. So I'll see what I can fit in anyway. So let's go. Vicky, Anthony, and Dominic, start off with all of us, all of you rather. What is the level of awareness about climate change and climate risk in your country, in companies, and also in the government and regulators that you deal with? Who wants to start? Maybe Vicky, could you?
Sure, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So as some of you may have noticed, we had a military coup about a year ago. The long term is not really top of mind for most people. And when Anouj in the earlier presentation talked about an 11% GDP loss by 2100, Myanmar lost 20% of GDP just last year. And in fact, it reminds me a little bit of comments that were made before the Asian financial crisis back in 1998 by one of the military ministers saying, you know, we don't need to worry about the Asian financial crisis because we created our own. So we have very little focus on these issues right now. And what we do have on paper is a very good 2018 to 2030 climate change strategy and master plan. But I went looking for it this morning on the government's website and found it sort of the equivalent of tucked behind a filing cabinet. So I don't think that anyone really within government is thinking beyond next week, let alone 20, 30 years time. And to the extent that climate change has been on government agenda, it's become a bit of a political football with our competing government in Naypyidaw and opposition government, both submitting identical nationally determined contributions. So, I mean, ironically, in many ways, the troubles that Myanmar is facing will at least be good for mitigation, in that obviously economic activity has gone down, not good for poverty, but certainly good for emissions. And there is, I think, more and more realization amongst businesses that they will need to start investing in things like solar to make themselves self-sufficient because of problems with the future perspectives on the national grid. But more important than mitigation, I think, is the worry that the climate adaptation risks, the climate risks for the country are just completely off agendas. As we heard on the presentation, it's second, I think, most climate risk affected country in the world. And in terms of population, I looked, it was 12th most exposed country in terms of the population around the sea levels. This is just not being discussed at all, sadly. So yeah, we're in a pretty bad way, and I don't think that there is realization at this stage of the need to act. Thank you.
Well, that's quite bleak. So a lot of exposure to the coastline, and well, going to a country where there's no exposure to the coastline. Anthony, you in Laos, what is the level of awareness of climate change there?
Thank you, Johan. So hello, everyone. So as we know, Laos is a landlocked country, so it's quite unique in that sense. But I think the climate change doesn't preclude us just because we are landlocked. Firstly, I wanted to share that I think the level of awareness in Laos is still quite nascent, but there has been quite a strong push both by the government and also from the I think general public or civil society to start looking into this in a very serious manner. So coincidentally, just on Friday, there was actually a meeting that was chaired by the Vice Minister of Natural Resources, Monray. And the government has actually just approved the 9th 5-year National Socio-Economic Development Plan, or NSED. And basically, there are a few things that are contained in this document. Number one of great interest is the government's commitment to now specify a date to actually go to a zero emission plan, and that is by the year 2050. I know it's a bit far out, but I think this is clearly a commitment by the government to achieve that. And secondly, it's also the government has also now documented a map of all the 148 districts in the country. There are 18 provinces and 148 districts in the country, and the government has now committed to keep 70% of these to be green zones. And I think that's a very big step from the government. There's also a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases from deforestation to about 30 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And to standardize the codes for electrical equipment are also now being established. And of course, there's also now a plan to reach the use of clean energy in transportation. And the commitment is to achieve 14% of all vehicles to be EV or clean energy or green. There's also a commitment from the government to build about 100 charging stations across the country. There have already been a few. There's already 2-3 cities that already have now charging stations, and there's now quite a interesting take-up on EVs. So I think the awareness comes from not just the pressure from global pressure on climate change, but also I think there is also a recognition by the government that over the last 30 years, from 1970 to 2010, if I'm not mistaken, there were a total of 33 natural disasters or hazards that have actually impacted Laos. That has impacted, I think, almost everyone in the country. We are a nation of about 7.3 million population, and that has caused economic damage equivalent to USD 400 million. So that's huge for a country like Laos. So I think all in all, there is awareness, there is recognition that this is a very important agenda and it can't be delayed. So the government has now approved this, and there's a commitment to achieve this zero emission by 2050.
Okay, so there's that commitment and a number of initiatives going on. What about the companies, Anthony? How is that?
So in terms of companies, it is actually quite rare that you hear these conversations. So things around sustainability, I think, is still quite new in this country. And a lot of these conversations or push is really coming from international organizations, from internationally owned organizations as well, or private companies. And it's slowly being discussed in conversations. I think in management is also still not very prevalent yet. But I think now with the push by the international bodies, and also it's kind of coming up from the ground up as well, because civil society is also now pushing this. There are a lot of NGOs that are now pushing this agenda. So it's kind of like the authorities are now looking into it, civil society is looking into it, but I think amongst organizations and private companies, it is still not a big topic yet. So I think a lot of room for awareness building, and I think a lot of work to be done in this space.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And now over to you, Dominic, in Vietnam. You've been there a long time, 30 years. So you've seen you've seen the ebb and flow of these kind of issues. And how has awareness crept up in Vietnam of climate change risks?
I think that's thank you, Johan, and good day to everybody. And it's great to see such a strong turnout. Congratulations to the organisers. I'm happy to be here. So while I'm not Vietnamese, I can maybe share what the feel is here. I mean, first point would be there's a term in Vietnamese which is an idiom to live together with the floods, and that of course is a metaphorical exhortation, but it's also very literal. So for many years, and I expect this is also true in Myanmar and Laos, people have, for example, viewed river flooding as actually a positive, because it brings alluvial soil, which is good for the next year's harvest. At least it did until recently. And so people have always accepted typhoons and weather patterns, but it is becoming apparent that the needle is moving. Although there's the question of the frogs in boiling water. Are we actually aware of the pace of change around us? But that would be the broad outlook. And of course, I think probably like where Vicky and Anthony are, there's a perception that this is somebody else's problem. Vietnam is 1.2% of the world's population, and I think it's 0.7 or 0.8% of the CO2 emission, global GHG emissions. So the perception is we're well below the average of the world. Notwithstanding that, there's been the last 5 years, a very remarkable commitment by government to promote renewable energy. And, that stems, I think, really from concerns of energy security when viewed against the alternatives. And Vietnam, of course, has been growing quite rapidly. So, this demand has come at the same time as the growing controversy over coal, for example. But everybody in Vietnam, and I think quite a lot of people outside Vietnam, have been really surprised by the traction that this solar and wind program has had. And as of today, 25% of the energy of Vietnam is produced through renewable energy that's been built in these last 3 or 4 years. It's a remarkable achievement, to the extent that the government is now dialing back on its support for a continuation of the tariff schemes. So that's one interesting spark that's certainly created an impact. But what really created an impact, I think that we're still trying to digest in Vietnam, was the Prime Minister Pham Minh Chin's commitments at Glasgow COP26, when he committed Vietnam to zero deforestation by 2030, zero new coal by 2040, and net zero by 2050. And these are 3 enormously brave commitments to make. And I think we're right on message with the spirit of COP26. He, of course, and very wisely said that these commitments have to be made on a conditional basis. That means to say that there has to be substantial assistance from overseas for Vietnam to deliver on its part. And so because of that, the needle is moving right up again in Vietnam, as all of us are struggling to come to terms with exactly what those commitments will mean. But I think rather like like Vicky and Anthony commented, at the end of the day, the level of awareness is still pretty low. For example, a lot of business people wouldn't even know what COP was. Very, very few people know about, for example, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. There is a government regulation in the securities markets that has had effect from the beginning of this year that obliges companies to report on their climate risks. That, of course, we understand to mean physical risk and transition risk, but they're really focusing on the transition risk. But as of yet, really no more than a handful of companies provide that data. And that really is where we stand at the moment. But as I say, the train has left the station. We've had a new environmental protection law from the beginning of this year, with an implementing decree that's caused a great deal of eyebrow raising amongst the business community. And only last week we had a landmark announcement that did quite surprise the market by one of the 2 aspirant auto producers. This is VinFast, part of Vingroup, that it's going to cease production of all of its internal combustion engines vehicles this year and move to be a 100% EV producer. So you can see the sparks beginning to happen, but I think we've still got some way to go.
Thank you. I'm just slightly speechless about the announcement on the cars. I didn't realize there was that much commitment. I think when we hear reporting about Glasgow COP26, we tend to listen to the main headlines from the biggest countries and what our own country said, and not so much, let's say, Malaysians listening to Vietnam and Laos and all that. So a lot of commitments made, and as you say, the train has very much left the station. And looks to me in Vietnam, in Laos as well, and perhaps the station's a bit unstable in Myanmar, so the train hasn't yet left, but hopefully will do. Okay, then secondly, what about, okay, we've heard from Anouj and so on about how ASEAN countries are very vulnerable to climate risk. So in terms of preparation of the businesses, is it equally rudimentary? How prepared are your businesses to mitigate and cope with climate risk? Is it like that with awareness quite low? They're also quite unprepared. Is that how it is? No, Vicky. Sorry.
The question to me. Yes, I think. So a couple of weeks ago, we had one of our Myanmar Institute of Directors director certification program training, and one of the case studies I gave as part of my ESG section was giving them various potential projects, investments such as a real estate in Yangon, a coastal resort, agricultural products factory, processing factory, and ask them to think through the risks, to do a pre-mortem on the projects. Not a single one of them spotted climate risk in any of those projects. It just was not on their radar screens. And in all of those cases, these are very real risks to that kind of investment. I think there's an element of head in the sand, particularly amongst many larger Myanmar businesses which are invested in construction and real estate, including in the Yangon market. They already have assets which are well overvalued beyond what they're really worth. And they just don't want to hear any bad news that actually these assets may be literally sinking in 5-10 years time, shortage of fresh water because saline intrusion is a major problem. So yeah, all of these things, I think that when you do present it to them, and I've started carrying around the coastalclimate.org map to show sea level rises and bringing that out at the dinner table, it does make them sit up. I was at dinner last week with a construction company who was about to go off to the coast to look at a property that they were going to, or look at an area they were going to buy to develop. So I showed them what that would be looking like in 2050. And they did look slightly pale after that. I think they still went to the beach. I haven't heard, then they've come back. But yeah, I mean, awareness, I think, is very low. Preparation is very low. We've had one or two companies who, again, as with Laos, have had the relationship with organizations like the IFC of the World Bank, which has then made them start to incorporate much more rigorous sustainability frameworks within their policies, within their management systems. We've had one example also of again, in the real estate sector, a company getting a green loan from UOB and OCBC in Singapore. So there are a few examples of the larger and more advanced companies starting to wake up to the potential opportunities here, but by and large, most of them are really not even aware of the risks, let alone the opportunities.
Okay, in that case, so in the interest of time, Anthony, Dominic, I'll sort of pass by you on this particular question. That possibly encapsulates the situation in most countries. Because Vicky mentioned, I'm confused, Vicky and Victoria were talking. So Vicky mentioned just now opportunities. Let's focus on that, Anthony and Dominic then. So we heard Victoria Hatton from PwC talking about opportunities for Southeast Asian businesses, but saying that the window perhaps is narrowing, is getting quite small. Do you see businesses or industries which are preparing to adapt in the face of climate risk. Will there be any winners where you are? Dominic mentioned, of course, your national car company, or I'm not sure if it's a government company or what, but any others that you can think of that are preparing to adapt and trying to win and not just survive.
Anthony, maybe I can step in while you're preparing your thoughts. This is a really interesting one because some years ago, as like many of us, I was trying to get my head around this climate change thing. A lady, a panelist from Africa, from West Africa, it was, said we need the business case to be made. And that comment has stuck with me ever since, because we here on this panel, I'm assuming, are almost all business people, and we have a fiduciary duty, particularly as directors, to our shareholders. Notwithstanding the comments about stakeholder capitalism, we have a fiduciary duty to run our businesses for profits, and so there needs to be and this is a global issue, a business case made. Now, I think where governments really should step in where everybody else fails, and governments have stepped in many countries with this sort of incentive scheme that I referred to earlier, which is great because it's creating, if you like, a market incentive to invest and commit. Regrettably, no government in the world is really committed to the step that's most obvious, which is to impose a tax on greenhouse gases, in particular on CO2. And that's for understandable reasons. Most politicians are elected, even in our part of the world, and as we've seen in France, the electorate responds extremely badly to taxes on carbon, and so politicians are reluctant to it. But to me, that is a big gap, and I think without that, it's extremely difficult for businesses to actually reorient their strategy. What we talk about here is a journey for businesses that begins with compliance, which is not necessarily the most interesting, but it's necessary to generate awareness, but moves very quickly, as soon as possible, to risk assessment. And I think risk assessment is how we can begin to approach a business case. So within my firm, Dragon, we have recently performed a climate risk disclosure in accordance with TCFD. And we focused on the physical risks in our business, and we focused on the transition risks. And we worked out, and this was, of course, there's plenty of garbage in, garbage out, and we need to do it again this year, and learn and all that. But we worked out that there was a climate risk of 3.5% on an annual basis to the value of our assets. So 3.5% in a single year, every year, it begins to make a business case for looking to mitigate, or if not to mitigate, to adapt. And on the transition risk, we assumed that if we were forced to pay the European price for the carbon, that was $20 million a year, $20 million a year every year on a portfolio of $2.5 billion. So you're beginning to see the business case being made, and I think it's a combination of on the one hand, difficult leads set by government, and maybe people such as ourselves on this call, the institutes of directors. I mean, I think we in the Vietnamese Institute, we had some debate about whether to move from governance to broaden our mandate to E&S, environment and social as well, because governance on its own is such a large and tricky issue in all of the countries we're working in. But, and I'm sure this is a common theme amongst us, the institutes here on the call, that you can't really talk about governance of businesses without tackling the issue of climate change. So I think we have also a role to play. And then I think if if there aren't obvious, business incentives, I think we should be looking at the risks. And the risks, I think, will begin to focus our attention.
Okay, so messages for risk committees, directors on risk committees, chief risk officers. Climate risk has got to be on there, and well, once it's on there, it has to be actually. And it's interesting. A Vietnamese company has gone and actually valued the risk, and has a number on it. Okay, Anthony, on this questions of adapting, are any companies or any industries moving on this in Laos? Oh, you're silent. Sorry, Anthony. The perennial question. Yes, you're muted. Now you're muted. You've muted yourself back again. And
sorry for wasting time.
Right.
I think one thing that's quite interesting about Laos is that number one, we know it's landlocked, and because it's landlocked, it has to think of many innovative ways to actually get around not having a seaport, and that's why now there's this desire to get into landlocked to land link and the development of a land port. So on the same note, I just want to touch on the point that Laos is quite unique because it's largely reliant on nature and natural resources for its main income generation. And some of the sectors that I'll talk about is, for example, agriculture, ecotourism, which is a really massive potential for Laos. It's got a really beautiful natural surrounding, and even if you see on my virtual backdrop that I've used, it's actually some really nice nature. That it's great for tourism, and even Laos being known as the battery of Asia largely is derived from hydro power, and now there's a big push into solar power. So having said this, I think a large part of the country is still kind of unspoiled, and I think why I'm saying this is there is this inertia or push for everyone to say, hey, look here, if you don't take care of all this, the large part of the revenue generation might not be around for long. And I think that has actually gotten everyone to now think about, even for agriculture, to look at sustainable agriculture using technology to actually take care of agriculture. There are a lot of startups that are now starting in this space. So I think that's the first point. The second point is because, as an economy, it's actually one of the last frontier countries in ASEAN. There's also not much baggage in this country, as in old archaic systems and all this kind of stuff. And because of that, there's also a big push to go digital. There's a big push or inertia to say, let's leapfrog, going to using online capabilities, and the central bank and also the government is now looking into creating, for example, a digital valley. So I think these are some opportunities to kind of look into new industries that will be more friendly towards the environment, if I could say.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry. I need to cut you off because we are now down to 7 minutes to go on our panel. And I do need to move on to another question. What about information? Do any of you feel that your governments or regulators are sharing the information and data which they have that can help companies, sharing with companies, or are you kind of in the dark about the actual data? How do you find that in your countries? Myanmar, I probably know the answer.
You probably know the answer. I mean, information has always been scarce, or reliable information has always been scarce in Myanmar, and there's an awful lot of tendency to generate information that your bosses will find be comfortable with. So bad news is not welcomed either. The tragedy that we have since the coup is that the international organizations, World Bank, ADB, and so on, have all effectively suspended programs since then. And they were the ones who were often investing in better generation of statistical and other data. So there is a lack of data at the government level, and that's combined, frankly, with a lack of trust on the part of the public and others in anything coming from government. So I think here that it's really much more now for the private sector, for NGOs to be generating the data. Yeah. To some extent, that data is available globally. But what I'm seeing, for example, is some private sector agriculture companies have good data on soil, climate impact, and so on. So obviously, this is competitive information for them, and we need to find a way that somehow some of the benefits of that at least can be shared, so that the country can become more resilient.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Data from government, and you've got that 2050 goal, haven't you? So maybe there are forecasts.
Yeah, so existingly data is quite scarce. I think at the government level, there's really some good data that's being generated, but it's not available publicly. So there's no real public source that you can actually find or search. I think the other point is that Laos, being a developing country, there's a lot of international organizations that are actually now in the country, and they are actually helping and working with the government to actually generate and develop this kind of data. And I think that is something that is very helpful. Just a simple point in case, even for myself, we got onto the World Bank panel for Laos, and one of the key safeguards is around ESG and climate change. And in this, developing this, they actually provide technical assistance, or TA, and that actually helps to share the relevant data. So I think it is still quite scarce, but it's being developed. Yeah.
Right, thank you. And Vietnam, Dominic.
Yeah, just very quickly. This is a good question, because data, information is very rare and sparse, I think, across the world. I think this is one of the huge problems in this rapidly changing area. I mean, I alluded to us and TCFD. I mean, we didn't get any of that data from Vietnam. We had to use a foreign company that used NASA data and GPS data, and so it is there, but the models are all very new. The technology is very new. It's you're taking actually a huge sort of venture risk in the first place, just engaging with people who are providing this data, because they are themselves such new companies. I think it's a huge issue. I think one area where I have to say that the EU are providing global leadership here. One of the issues which I think some of us are going to come across very, very swiftly is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is a tax being imposed by the EU on imports from wherever they come in the world, to neutralize the taxes that apply in Europe on specific products. So to take an example here, if you happen to export steel to Europe, not many of us do perhaps, but if you do, then you will be asked to pay the same as what European steelmakers are producing on your steel. Bear in mind, the European price for carbon is now $100 a ton, 80 euros a ton. So, and let's take cement as another one. Cement is nearly 1 ton of carbon for 1 ton of cement. Now, we're not exporting cement and steel to the EU, but we are exporting cement. We're exporting other products, and let's just bear in mind, for example, agriculture. I think it's good. Agriculture is one of those areas that politicians, again, don't like touching because it's so elemental. It's almost a taboo subject. But in most of our countries, agriculture, which would include deforestation, include animal agriculture, it will include rice, and everything else, is 20 to 25% of our total emissions. And by the time that people start imposing a tax on, let us say, methane, GHG, that comes from animal agriculture, then we're going to be hitting our pockets on exports of meat and other commendables. So I think we're going to be forced, and as I think one of the early speakers said, first movers will have an advantage. I mean, that's very difficult because when people tell you first movers have an advantage, you don't necessarily believe them. But I genuinely believe in this space that that we need to get ahead of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Listen, we've heard perspectives from all three of you: Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar. I've got a list of questions on this other screen here that I don't have time to go to. I do apologize to Fai, Zai, Hani, Naradlan, Robert, umpteen of you there. I do apologize. Shiv, Mr. Anonymous. can't get to you at all. We need to talk more about this. We need to learn from each other's countries. Seems to me that no matter all this stuff, there are three golden threads running through the discussion have come out today. Apart from the fact that we need to know more about each other in order to succeed as partners and as competitors as well. But firstly, awareness levels about climate risk, very different country by country in both business sector and government, but all businesses need to be ready to manage these risks. Investors, customers, lenders, even our own staff are going to be pushing for this as time goes on and increasingly quickly. Climate change is coming and we will need to adapt both as companies and as countries. So how are we going to cope? Some players will not only cope, but will actually profit. And so the question is, will we be amongst those who are able to not just survive, but also to succeed and do well at the end of this? And Dr. Hatton from PwC showed us some steps that she didn't have time to go through that companies and industries can take. Lastly, in order to mitigate and adapt, we need information. And this is a message to government. In a region where information, holding it to our own chest was how we did it in the past, information has to be shared with us in order that the companies can play the full part alongside government and civil society in meeting and dealing with climate change. So the data is mostly with governments, and our governments, please, need to share. Time is up, and so I need to thank you, Vicky Bowman, Anthony Chin, and Dominic Scriven. Well done, good job, everybody. And lastly, happy Valentine's Day to all of you. And back to you, Sita. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Johan, Vicky, Anthony, and Dominic for the perceptive sharing. Now, our final session for today is a panel discussion. This panel, moderated by the excellent Shai Ganu from the Singapore Institute of Directors, will dive deeper into the role of company directors in the climate crisis. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please do post your burning questions in the Q&A box, as Shai and his panelists will have a go at answering them. Shai, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sita. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from whichever part of the world you've dialed in. Let me pick up from where Johan left off by, first of all, wishing everybody a very happy Valentine's Day. And more importantly for today's conversation, happy Valentine's Day and an opportunity to express our love for planet Earth. And so this panel, the second panel, we are very fortunate to have strong representation from senior business leaders and directors from three powerhouses in economies in ASEAN. So I'll quickly introduce the panelists and we'll dive straight into the conversation. This is always the risk of being last in any session, that you run out of time. So I know we're short of time, but we'll try to do justice to the subject. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Kun Collin, who is the CEO of the Thai Institute of Directors. He's currently a director at the Financial Institution Policy Committee and one of the main committees of the Bank of Thailand, and is also currently a member of the Stock Exchange of Thailand Sustainability Award Committee. Welcome, Kun Collin. Next is Ibu Ria. She's on the board of Institute of Corporate Directors in Indonesia. She currently serves as a member of the board of PT Embak Ventura, as a nominee director of IFC World Bank, and is an active trainer and facilitator for IICD for corporate directors on governance and sustainability issues. And last but not least, we have Dante Briones, who's a fellow from Philippines Institute of Corporate Directors. Dante is a founder, chairman, and CEO of Sasonibi Solar, a solar PV systems integrator. He's a board member of Oronax Development Corporation and MicroD International, and is also a member of the Management Association of Philippines, the Philippines Institute of Industrial Engineers, and was the president of Philippine Solar Power Alliance, the country's first solar industry association. So welcome all. And just setting the context for this conversation, as we've heard in the earlier panel, we dug deep into the role of companies and private enterprise in the climate change discussion. I think in this conversation, we want to focus more on the role of the board as it comes to managing climate change. And over the past year, we've all been exposed to terms such as ESG, business stewardship, climate change, and the alphabet soup of acronyms. But the focus of this panel will be very much on the role of the board in the climate crisis, which touches very much on the E, but also on the S and the G, as I'm sure the panelists will share. And so maybe let's get started. A question for Dante. In your experience of speaking to board members, fellow directors, how aware are they of their duties that relate to climate change? And in light of new developments at investors' expectations, that directors may be responsible for being for managing the climate crisis and climate transitions for their companies. So just keen to hear your opening remarks about the role of the board in this equation.
Thanks, Shai. We've been very fortunate enough to have ICD as an organization in the Philippines. We are an organization of independent directors, and our organization has been very supportive of initiatives on climate change and ESG. And in fact, we conduct seminars and webcons, of which you participated in one that I moderated. So the level of awareness, at least to the members of the Institute of Corporate Directors in the Philippines, is very, very high, because the organization itself has been pushing for it. Now, as independent directors, I guess it is our fiduciary role to open the eyes of the companies that we sit in on matters relating to this, right? It is our responsibility to say our piece, whether the company we sit in the board in as independent directors is being done. The other fortunate thing that this country is about is the Securities and Exchange Commission of the Philippines require all the publicly listed companies, the board of directors of all the publicly listed companies, to attend an annual director orientation. And ESG and climate change is part of the agenda of all those orientations. So the awareness is there for publicly listed companies. Then the other good thing about our situation here is the Management Association of the Philippines, of which I'm a member, is also on top of the situation. And we have a special committee just handling climate change and handling ESG. And so the level of awareness, you know, the Management Association of the Philippines is an organization of CEOs and C-level executives in the Philippines, and these mostly are the board of directors of these companies as well, right? So the level of awareness is very high. However, that's the big corporations. These are the big entities, right? My concern now is how to bring it down to the level of awareness of the board members of the small and medium business, right? So I think I will speak about that later when I talk about the big companies, the family-owned big corporations in the Philippines and what they're doing about ESG and climate change. Thank you, Shai.
Thank you, Dante. That's a great way of getting us started. I'm sure we'd love to hear more about the role of family businesses and conglomerates, but we'll get to that in a minute. Maybe turning to Kun Colin. As we've discussed, Kun Colin, that climate change has moved from an ethical or environmental issue to a critical consideration in the way boards oversee risk, strategy, and corporate disclosures. And we've just heard from the other panel that businesses need to change their models and priorities to weather the storm, pun intended, of course. But how aware would you say directors are of their legal obligations when it comes to climate change? Are they right to be worried about potential breach of duty if they do not reposition their companies for a zero carbon world?
Well, the question is that what are the level of awareness of the board of directors on the legal liabilities?
That's correct.
That's probably where we want to take. But if that is the question, maybe I have to step back and maybe talk a little bit about what Dante just talked, which is about fiduciary duty. Duty of care, duty of obedience, disclosure, and loyalty. Duty of care. The first question that the board need to ask right now is, what does climate change mean to our business and our stakeholders? I think that's really, really important, especially net zero when it comes. What is going to happen to our industry, our organization? Are we going to survive? Or even can we take advantage of that? If you understand the impact on stakeholder, that is the holy grail to beauty of loyalty. Because you will understand that it's not only equity holder, it's not only the investor, but you have set of responsibility to quite a few set of accountability, which leads to another thing, which is obedience. When your question, which is Shai, which is about the regulation. Right now, the board has to exercise duty of obedience beyond the regulator, because they have to meet the expectation of the stakeholders. And if they don't exercise duty of care and duty of loyalty, they don't understand what they have to comply with. And legal is just a baseline. And then last but not least, I want to change this to duty from this duty of disclosure to duty of engagement. Because engagement is two-way, and we can't engagement and disclosure is one way, and we can't do one way anymore in this world. So yes, coming back to the board right now, with I can imagine right now, if we have watched the film called Perfect Storm, the board imagine all the ships there are the companies, the management, and the board is at the lighthouse, and they'll have to do their best to, on that perfect storm, understand all the risks, including sustainability risk, and then see how to guide the management out of that storm.
Excellent, thank you. That is really good counsel, and I suspect we'll come back to this theme later on. But I think that is good advice to think beyond just duty of disclosure to duty of engagement, and a lot of companies will take should pay attention to that counsel. So thank you, Colin. Ibu Ria, maybe turning to you. So we know that the board's role in dealing with climate change is still an emerging issue in ASEAN. And so do you think tackling climate change should be a responsibility of governments and policymakers, or companies and boards, or all of the above?
Thank you, Sai. To answer these questions, I would like to put us into the context of my country. This is to give us the perspective of what does it take to talk, or what does it take to tackle the climate change. Indonesia has been active to tackle the climate change through Conference of Parties since 2009 to 2020 in Glasgow, but has committed the Indonesia National Determined Contribution only at the end of 2021, at which they submitted the contribution for climate change to reduce emission from 2020 to 2030. By looking at this, the regulation or the government, regulator or the government is putting the intention to tackle it from 2020 to 2030. Indonesia recognized its role in contributing, in combating the global climate change. As a signal, they have established a high office in the Forestry and Environmental Ministry called Climate Change General Directorate. That Indonesia is also vulnerable to natural disaster due to climate change and exposed to recurrent natural calamity, being in the ring of fires, and hence required vast amount of contingency resources to manage, including for rehabilitation and reconstruction. Therefore, Indonesia environment conditions need massive capacity in providing resources for climate change adoption. Adding to it, the Indonesian government started to earmark around 4.1% of the state budget for emissions, but this is only a very small fraction of the capacity required. Therefore, they need to collect the collaboration from other parties which have the accountability for the climate change towards achieving the net zero emissions. Why? Because the government is taking into account the economic growth, the climate resilience, and the impartiality, which means involvement of various elements of ecosystem to include the economic player. Therefore, to answer the questions, it is very obvious tackling the climate change should be the responsibility of all, be it the government and policymakers, ordinary people, communities, or companies, hence the boards. That's the answer.
Well said, Ipuria, and I love that sentiment about collaboration. I mean, that sentiment of collaboration is so evident even in today's event, where 8 out of the 10 director institutes in ASEAN have come together with this climate governance network. So clearly, when it comes to climate change, what is needed is collaboration, not competition. And so different constituents need to work together. So thank you for that. That was brilliant. Maybe, Colin, just turning back to you. So in your experience, how ready are boards to engage meaningfully with the strategic imperatives associated with climate transition? And particularly if you think about interconnected supply chains in ASEAN, what should boards be worried about?
Oh, that's a big question. What should board be worried about? I think board will have to be mindful, let's say, use this word mindful, about 4 Ps. The first one is purpose. Please revisit the purpose of your organization. It's been there for years and years and years, and the world has changed. Is it still relevant? For example, there is a listed company in Thailand, Banpu, which is coal mining. And 5-6 years ago, they revisited their purpose, and then they also realized that they can't be the coal mining company anymore. They have to be the face of the future generation of energies. So with that, they revisited their purpose, and board has to make sure that the management can implement it. Board has to ask a question about culture transformation, such as Banpu. When it's a mining, it's one kind of culture, which is mining culture. Safety. But if it's about energy and new kinds of energy, okay, safety is still very important. But what about other innovations? So it's a different game. So I think that the first thing that the board has to reassess is, what do we stand for? Is it still relevant? The second P, I would say partnership. I think we have talked about collaboration. And, even, today, while we're talking, I was thinking, okay, now Institute of Directors in Asia get together for this program, but have we aligned our KPIs? If we have not aligned our KPI, maybe it's just not deep enough to make it happen, right? So, so partnership has to be deep enough to make it happen. For example, another example that we see is that some of the Thai companies, we are just OEM, so we produce as ordered. So in order for us to be like the first mover advantage, the top tier of the global, we can't. But we need to work with the first mover advantage. There is some kind of, that's a case of Tantawan, which is it's called Sunflower. It's a very big plastic company in Thailand. They're very successful. And it turned around by working with IKEA. If you partner with a global leader in sustainability, you will be automatically there, but it's not a rosy path, definitely. The third one is the policy. But if they don't issue a stringent policy and make sure it's being implemented, then it's a waste of time because everything is just a dream, you know, kind of what is a supplier there and supplier and vendor policy, what should be their standard in ESG, or what is our people policy. Even that with the policy, you know, when the board has so many things, maybe subcommittee on sustainability, on climate change. Right now, we see a lot of that's going on. Last but not least is performance. So we mentioned purpose, partnership, policy, and the last one is performance. This one, when we look at performance, look at Asia context. Because when we look at performance from international context, sometimes lots of, for example, DJSI is a great benchmark, but it's a global benchmark. But climate change is very local, very personal. And we have to understand the impact, because if we don't understand what's going to happen to our country or our region, then we don't know which of the indicators are more meaningful to us. So it's very important that performance, please, we have to understand why we do what we do. What is the problem that Asia has, and how we're gonna together in this room deal with it together. Thank you.
Very well said. And again, contextualizing it back to our region, first of all, in ASEAN, but then each of our local countries. And the 4 Ps, I think, will stand good guidance for a lot of participants on this call. So thank you, Colin. Ibu Ria, and maybe just building on the peculiarities of the unique nature of ASEAN, and a specific question related to Indonesia and its dual board structures, where Indonesia has a separate board of commissioners and board of directors. And clearly the issue of climate change should be on the agenda of both boards. But what are your views about the effective governance models for climate issues? And how can BOC and BOD members upskill themselves or equip themselves to address these responsibilities?
Actually, the law, which we call the law of limited liability, Undang-Undang PT, is stipulating in essence, the segregation of duties of the organ of the companies. It is stipulated in the law, the organ of the companies are 3. First, the shareholders meeting. Second, the board of commissioners, and then the board of directors. The board of commissioners is to oversight, and it is assisted by committees specifically to help the board of commissioners. They are not committees which is helping the board of directors. And the board of directors is the executive. What is the difference between the two? They both have the fiduciary duties. They both have to be in the good faith and duty of care. They both have to be transparent and accountable. They both have to be expertise in their field and their competence. But the board of commissioners is control. They control the activities of the business, whether it is in compliance, as what Kevin says, comply with the stakeholders requirements or expectation complies with the shareholders' expectations. The way the limited liability law constructed is making us responsible for all stakeholders, not only shareholders. And then secondly, the Board of Commissioners is representing and representing the shareholders and report to the shareholders meeting. Whereby the Board of Directors as executive runs the company daily operations, and they are entrusted with the company's capital. So they have to optimize. When we are talking about sustainability of the company is on their hands, but it doesn't mean the Board of Commissioners doesn't have the share of the responsibility, because they have to oversight to make sure that the people, the directors who do the sustainability efforts is doing it in a good corporate governance way. Well, you're asking, what is the effective governance models? The governance is based on the fact that BOD and BOC are the source of directions for the company's purpose. Therefore, naturally in the position to help the business prioritize climate actions. And then BOC, by definition, take more long-term view and hold BOD accountable for delivering the goals, which goes short-termly, year by year, to the long term. And then the third one is the BOC can drive the collaboration. How they upskill and equip themselves to address this responsibility? First of all, they have to understand. I love to refer to Kevin saying that, do they know what they have to do? Yeah. Now, that's why they have to know what are the two basics of the climate governance required, and they have to gear themselves towards it. First, the climate governance is the diplomacy, the mechanism and response measure aimed at steering social system towards preventing, mitigating, or adopting the risk posed by the climate change. Second, they have to know that the second basic is about governance of climate adaptation. It involves the collective efforts of multiple societal actors to address problems or to reap the benefits associated with the impacts of the climate change. Once they understand these are the basic of the governance, they know what they need, and there are experts all over the place, and there are also the very good data can be provided by some of our keynote speakers today that they can use and they can refer to, so they know where to get the skills, where to get the expertise for them to be able to do their responsibility in terms of climate governance. Very important to remember that Board of Commissioners is helped by committees. To make the governance better, they have to make a committee especially for climate governance, so that they have support which will specifically help them to understand down to the technical level, which because the directors doesn't have to be on the technical level. They have to be literate, of course. Now, but they have to have the helper, the support of experts, which is in the committee of the climate governance. I hope that answers
Absolutely.
your questions.
It does very much so. And I am taking a lot of heart by your sentiment that the Board of Commissioners should have a climate change committee. Maybe we should have a discussion about influencing companies in Indonesia and across the region to have an ESG or a climate committee. Thank you for that, Ibu Ria. Dante, coming back to you, and you touched on this theme earlier, but As you know, or as we've discussed, a disproportionately large number of companies in ASEAN have a controlling shareholder. May it be the founding family business or conglomerates or the sovereign wealth fund. So what do you see as the role of these companies, these conglomerates or family businesses or family founded businesses? What's their role in driving climate change and balancing both the short and long-term priorities?
It's a very good question, Shai. And in fact, you are very right. The biggest corporations in the Philippines are owned by conglomerates and families. So let me answer that question by giving you actual examples of which companies are, of these companies and what they're doing, right? For example, First Gen is one of the biggest power generation companies. And a few years ago, the CEO announced to the whole world that they will go 100% clean and renewable. They only sell clean and renewable energy. It was amazing. And I think that was so admirable. This is controlled by the Lopez family. And then Ayala Corporation made a commitment that they will achieve net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050 as an integral part of their group's integrated corporate governance, risk management, and sustainability strategy, conforming to the Paris Agreement, right? So, for example, specifically BPI, which is their financing arm, this is their bank, will not finance any new greenfield power generation projects. Will only finance. The bank will reduce its power generation exposure to zero by 2030. So no more coal power plant financing for them. Globe, which is its telecommunications arm, is active in Race to Zero, and SBTI has shifted to buying energy directly from renewable sources only, right? AC Energy is one of the biggest renewable energy companies now in the Philippines. Century Pacific, one of the biggest food companies, through its coconut manufacturing arm, Century Pacific Agriculture Ventures, aims to be carbon neutral by 2028 by providing quality coconut seedlings to small coconut farmers, enabling them to plant productive coconut trees, replacing non-fruit bearing senile ones. As a result, the initiative expands long-term coconut supply in Mindanao and help provide additional income to some 16,000 families in the area. It's amazing. JG Summit, owned by the Gokongwei family. By the way, Century Pacific is controlled by the Po family. JG Summit, controlled by the Gokongwei family, its real estate arm, Robinson's Land Corporation, has built 32 megawatts worth of solar energy plants in all its commercial properties. It's amazing, and it's part of their it's part of their strategy, part of a corporate initiative at the board level. So, to a small company like me, what do I do? I mean, I'm not as big as they are, but to us, it's even suffice to say that we are doing everything to increase the level of awareness of our employees by putting up agreements with, for example, in our case, with the Masungi Geo Reserve, and bring all our employees to this natural parks and receive lectures on climate change so that they're aware of what is going on regarding to climate change. And as small as company as we are able to do that. So what's my take in all of this? What's my answer to your question? Climate change mitigation is good for business. This is not just an initiative to look good and to feel good and to save the earth. This is good for business, as what these companies have shown, right? The drive, what these companies have shown is that successful drive against climate change starts with the board. It started with the owners of these companies. They were the ones, the controlling interest is the ones pushing for it, right? The strategic initiatives had measurable targets and time-bound targets. In other words, Ayala said this by this date, Century Pacific said by this date, and so on and so forth. So it's all monitored at the board level, and you could imagine that their board sessions will have a specific session in reporting the scorecard in relation to these initiatives. And in fact, I have verified that all of these companies have board level committees on climate change and risk mitigation, right? So it is good for the business. And my ask of these companies is only a few. Number one, since they have the influence and they have the leverage, they have to drive down that thinking, that advocacy to the value chain, right? They have a strong influence on their suppliers. So I'm sure they could do something so that their suppliers can be turned into like-minded corporation. But they need to assist them, right? They have to show to them the way. They have to create templates that these small, medium business companies who do not have money flowing out of their ears to go into this kinds of undertaking, and convince them and increase the level of awareness that climate change initiatives is good for their business, and even to the point of bringing this down to their own customers, because they have the influence and they have all the resources to make it happen. But lastly, I think we have to, they need to help to bring it down to the employee level, to the individual level, increase their awareness and convince their own employees and the families of their own employees and the members of their community that they're helping, that the fight against climate change is the fight for everyone. Get everybody involved so that come election, these people will vote for the right politicians, because as mentioned earlier by my co-panelists, there is a big role that the government will play. It cannot just be the private sector. It cannot just be the government sector. It has to be both the government and the private sector. So where does the government get its power? From the voters. So it is very important that this issue is brought down to the individual level, to the employee level, and to the members of the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dante. Very, very passionate call for action to companies there. So I really, really appreciate that. We are running short of time, and I'm sure we could speak for another 2 hours about this topic. But maybe in interest of time, Ibu Ria, Kun Colin, or you, Dante, any last comments, last remarks, 30 seconds each if you want to share anything?
Okay. Should I go first?
Please.
Okay.
Please. Please.
3 C's for the board. 3 C's. We have 4 P's.
4 P's and 3 C's.
And 3
okay.
C's. First is care like a parent. When you care about your business like you care your children, it's so profound that it's not 9 to 5. You want to understand the world that they're facing. There's an emotional attachment to that. We are talking about climate governance. If we change that a little bit, we are here to govern our children's future. Tie our heart into it. So that's care like a parent. When you care like a parent, you understand that there's a lot of things that you don't know that you don't know.
Yep.
So that is curious like a child. Directors, sometimes the vulnerability of directors is that they were invited because of their profound experience.
Yeah.
But they have to learn too, and they have to be curious. They have to unlearn and relearn. And last but not least, the last C, which is really important, is courage.
Excellent.
So please, we need to act now.
Care, curiosity, courage. I love it.
Care, curiosity, and courage. Because if we don't act now, there'll be no world left for us.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, Kun Colin. Ibu Ria, any last words from you?
Yeah. Climate change is the dominant threat of a global life. And the threat for the future of our children, of the future generations. We have to learn from whatever happens in terms of things that threaten the global life. And there is a lesson in global sustainability derived from the COVID-19 pandemic. That is environmental, social, governance, and economic issues are intricately related. So if you only think about profit, you are, what shall I say?
Not doing enough, or you're being very myopic about it. I understand.
Indonesian word is ketinggalan zaman.
Okay.
Out of date. Yeah, that's
Okay,
the word,
fair enough.
out of date. So because you have to think sustainability is about the long-term sustainability, not
Indeed.
only the short-term sustainability.
Thank you,
Thank
Iberia.
you.
That is excellent. Dante, quick 30 seconds.
Yeah, fight for climate change. Fight against climate change is good for business. Fight against climate change is good for the earth. Fight against climate change is good for everyone, for all the
Brilliant.
inhabitants of this world. And therefore, it is our responsibility to fight it.
Brilliant. I'll hand back to Sunita, but just to wrap up this conversation, if you take nothing away from this session, just take one request or one suggestion. Companies who do this successfully, i.e. integrate climate change into their business priorities, they are not doing this solely out of the goodness of their hearts. The moral imperative will only take us so far. For this to be sustaining and meaningful change, companies should appreciate the business benefits that come out of it, which Dante, you made that point excellent. And in the spirit of Valentine's Day, I'll end with a song from Elvis Presley, not a love song this time though, but a call to action for everybody is little less conversation, time for a little more action, please, when it comes to climate change.
I thought it's the one that called "It's Now or Never."
Very good.
Very good.
Sunita, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow, what a great session this has been. We're trying to keep to the time and we're 1 minute over time now. This is a great overview right from the beginning, all the way up to the last panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you all the speakers so very much. We recognize very clearly that we need to continue this journey together. I loved care, curiosity, and courage. I think we all recognize there's an urgent need for businesses to work closely with government. We need the policy frameworks, the incentives, that accurate and timely data is a huge issue. I think we all recognize that the way we are going to make things, the way that we're going to source for things, the way that we're going to finance what we do, the way we value businesses and scarce resources like arable land and water and clean and fresh air, all of this is going to change. So let us all think hard about how we can individually step up to meet the urgent needs of this existential crisis and make a real difference. There's going to be a series of webinars coming up with this ASEAN platform that we're curating in close collaboration with the Sustainable Finance Institute of Asia. I look forward to seeing all of you at these future sessions. Thank you so much for your time. Back to you, Sita. Oh, Karina, is there something that you wanted to say, Karina? This is a great session, wasn't it? Karina, we can't hear you. Okay, sorry, we just can't hear you. Sorry. Okay, Sita, back to you.
Thank you, Sunita. Thank you to the chairman of the ASEAN Climate Governance Network, which is now officially launched. And thank you for attending this event. Before you leave, please help us by completing the survey poll so we can serve you better. Do also subscribe for news about upcoming events. And the details are in the chat box below. Looking forward to seeing you all again at our next event. Thank you and happy Valentine's Day. Before we end the webinar, I'd like to kindly request all the panelists to stay back for a group photo, please. Thank you.